The air inside the packed debate hall in Manhattan buzzed with anticipation. Under dazzling stage lights and in front of a national audience, two of America's most polarizing young political figures were about to collide. Karoline Leavitt, rising Republican firebrand, and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the unapologetic face of progressive Democrats. The event had been billed simply as a Future of America town hall, but everyone in the room knew this was more than a discussion. This was going to be a political showdown. Karoline stepped backstage, her heels clicking steadily against the polished floor. Dressed in a sharp red blazer and wearing her signature cross necklace, subtle but defiant, she took a breath and adjusted the microphone clipped to her lapel. Her team had warned her AOC would try to dominate the conversation, to paint her as inexperienced, extreme, even irrelevant. But Karoline didn't come to play defense. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez waited on stage, smiling graciously at the moderator, exchanging a few words with the crowd. She looked calm, comfortable, until her eyes locked onto Karoline entering from the wings. The smile twitched, just slightly. The crowd erupted into applause as Karoline took her seat. Cameras panned, hashtags trended, and before a single word was spoken, the tone had been set. This wasn't going to be a debate, it was going to be a battle of narratives. And Karoline knew she couldn't afford to blink. The moderator introduced the event, setting the theme: climate policy, border security, economic future. All buzzwords. But beneath them, a much deeper fight was simmering over who gets to define America's direction. And with millions watching, Karoline leaned forward, ready to speak. Not as a politician trying to please, but as a woman determined to disrupt. The moderator barely finished the first question before Alexandria leaned into the microphone, voice smooth but sharp. "The Republican agenda is built on fear," she declared. "Fear of the future, fear of change, and fear of people who don't look like them." The crowd, mostly liberal, erupted in applause. Alexandria gave a practiced smile, locking eyes with Karoline like a warning shot. For a moment, the spotlight shifted toward AOC's confidence, her rhythm, her experience on that kind of stage. Karoline didn't flinch. When the applause died, she adjusted her mic and spoke. Her voice was calm, but it cut clean. "You say we're afraid of the future, Congresswoman," Karoline said, leaning forward. "I think we just believe the future deserves truth. And truth doesn't come from moral grandstanding, it comes from accountability." The crowd murmured. Some clapped, others frowned. Alexandria raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Karoline continued, eyes locked on AOC. "You've had your chance to lead a generation, and what did it bring us? Record inflation, unsafe cities, open borders, and division masquerading as progress. If that's your idea of the future, count me out." The moderator tried to step in, but the electricity in the room was undeniable. Alexandria smiled tightly, realizing Karoline hadn't come to play the role of the token opposition. She had come to turn the script upside down. And just like that, the power dynamic started to shift. Alexandria crossed her arms slightly, leaning into the mic with her trademark composure. "You talk about division, Karoline, but what you're selling is regression. You want to take this country back to a time when people like me wouldn't have had a voice on this stage." Her tone was laced with righteous fire, years of activism, of protest, of platforming justice. The crowd roared in approval. Karoline didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, then picked up her microphone again, this time without waiting for the moderator. "With respect," she began, the words deliberately chosen, "you're not the only one who's had to fight to be heard. I'm a conservative woman who grew up in a working-class family, told by every institution that I'd never make it if I didn't toe the liberal line. I chose a different path, and that scares people like you." The tension in the room thickened. "You stand here as if you invented struggle," Karoline continued, eyes locked on AOC. "But struggle doesn't belong to one party. You weaponize identity to silence debate. And now that someone challenges your ideas, suddenly it's oppression? Number, this isn't oppression. It's just competition. A low wave of murmurs ran through the crowd, mixed reactions, uncertain emotions. Alexandria adjusted her posture, clearly thrown off by the angle Karoline had taken. This wasn't the stereotypical right-wing attack she was used to swatting away. It was personal, grounded, and delivered with icy precision. "I don't stand here to undo progress," Karoline said, her voice steady. "I'm here to make sure it's real, not wrapped in slogans, but rooted in truth." Even those who disagreed couldn't ignore it. Karoline had drawn a line, not just between policies, but between performances and conviction. And she wasn't done yet. The moderator, sensing the weight of the moment, shifted gears. "Let's talk solutions," he offered, clearly hoping to cool the tension. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, how do you propose we address the growing economic disparity without alienating small business owners and working families?" Alexandria seized the opportunity, delivering a passionate monologue about wealth redistribution, systemic reform, and the promise of Green New Deal investments. It was articulate, practiced, and ideologically pure, everything her base expected. But Karoline was ready. She didn't match Alexandria's volume or intensity. Instead, she spoke like someone tired of rehearsed outrage. "It's interesting," she said, folding her hands on the table. "You talk about redistributing wealth while attending gala events in designer gowns and sipping champagne with elites who have never touched a shovel." The crowd shifted uneasily. "I grew up watching my father work double shifts to keep the lights on. We didn't wait for a handout. We worked, we budgeted, we sacrificed. And now you want to punish people like him, like millions of Americans, for succeeding? That's not equity. That's resentment with lipstick." There was a pause. Even Alexandria couldn't hide the flicker of offense. Karoline didn't stop. "You say you're for the people, but your policies crush the very backbone of this country. Middle-class entrepreneurs, single moms trying to build something real, not just chant slogans into a megaphone." The room felt heavy, not because of volume, but because truth, when sharp enough, doesn't need to yell. Alexandria exhaled slowly. Her grip on the microphone tightened. The lines were drawn. But for the first time that evening, it was Karoline who had taken the lead, not just in rhetoric, but in relevance. And she was only halfway done. The moderator glanced between them, visibly aware that this was no longer a policy discussion. It had become a referendum on authenticity. The next question was about public trust in government. A softball maybe for someone like AOC. But the crowd had shifted, eyes turned toward Karoline, waiting. Alexandria leaned in first. "Public trust begins when we stop catering to the wealthy and start listening to the people. Wall Street shouldn't write our laws. Billionaires shouldn't write our climate policy. That's not democracy. That's oligarchy." Applause echoed through the hall, but it felt different now. Like muscle memory. Karoline waited. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped in tone, not aggressive, not rushed, controlled. "You talk about trust, Congresswoman," she said, "but it's hard for Americans to trust politicians who preach humility from private jets, who call for unity but label anyone who disagrees as a threat to democracy. That's not leadership. That's branding." The room was quiet. "I've sat at kitchen tables where parents are deciding whether to pay rent or fill the gas tank. They don't trust Washington anymore because Washington stopped trusting them, and no hashtag or soundbite is going to change that." Now there was a shift in the crowd, not thunderous applause, but something more telling: stillness, attention, a realization that this young woman, dismissed as a lightweight by her critics, was dismantling the frame one sentence at a time. Alexandria tapped her pen against the table. Her usual counterattack, the clapback tweet, the viral zinger, didn't seem to fit here. Because Karoline wasn't performing, she was testifying. and the crowd could feel it. The moderator paused for breath, then asked a pointed question, one that had been making the rounds on social media all week. Does either of you believe the other truly loves this country? It was meant to be rhetorical, safe. But in that room, it landed like a thunderclap. Alexandria smiled coolly. I believe Karoline loves her version of America, she said carefully, but it's one rooted in nostalgia, in going backward, not forward. And sometimes, love isn't enough when your vision excludes the people already here. There it was, the sting, a masterful pivot into moral superiority. Karoline didn't blink. She picked up the mic and let a few seconds of silence pass. I do love this country, she said quietly. So much that I refuse to watch it be torn apart by narratives that pit neighbor against neighbor. I don't love an idea of America. I love the real one. Flawed, messy, but still the greatest force for freedom the world has ever known. The audience was silent now, not disengaged, but leaning in. And I don't think loving America means apologizing for it at every turn, Karoline added. It means defending it, not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. All of ours. A man in the back clapped once, loudly. Others followed, slowly, then with rising energy. The kind of applause that comes not from agreement, but respect. Alexandria looked toward the moderator as if expecting the next question, but he didn't interrupt. Because everyone in that room understood. Something had shifted. This wasn't just about left versus right. It had become a confrontation between two visions of patriotism, one institutional, one insurgent, and Karoline had just taken the crowd with her. The moderator adjusted his notes and leaned forward, tone slightly sharper now. Ms. Leavitt, would you support legislation that limits harmful speech in the name of equity and public safety? It was a curveball, framed innocently enough, but loaded with political dynamite. You could almost hear the breath holding across the auditorium. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez perked up, sensing the trap was well laid. She turned toward Karoline, clearly expecting a rigid constitutionalist response, something she could swat down with a progressive soundbite. Karoline took a slow breath. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tapped lightly on the table. That question, she said evenly, is exactly why Americans are losing trust in government. She paused just long enough to hold the room in suspense. Because we've gone from debating ideas to policing them. From persuasion to punishment. And we disguise that shift under words like equity, when what we're really doing is trading freedom for control. The moderator tilted his head, a silent cue to continue. Alexandria crossed her arms. Let's be clear, Karoline went on. I condemn hate speech. I believe in civility. But the First Amendment wasn't written to protect polite conversation. It was written to protect speech that makes people uncomfortable, especially speech critical of those in power. She turned slightly toward AOC now. What happens when the definition of harmful becomes subjective? What happens when it's defined not by the people, but by the government? You may like who's in charge today, but what about tomorrow? A murmur swept the audience. Karoline was just warming up. You say you want to protect marginalized voices. So do I. But here's the difference. I don't believe protection means censorship. I believe it means ensuring everyone, and no matter their background, has the right to speak, argue, protest, question, and yes, even offend. AOC broke in. So we just let hate flourish? Karoline didn't flinch. We don't let it flourish. We defeat it. In the open, with better ideas, with truth, not silence. You don't stop a fire by banning words. You stop it by flooding it with light. Now there was real movement in the crowd. Nods. A few surprised claps. Karoline turned back to the moderator. The power to silence is the most dangerous power a government can hold. And I won't hand it over. Not even to people I agree with. Alexandria stared at her. Expression unreadable. But the crowd had shifted again, this time in Karoline's favor. After a brief pause, the moderator posed what was supposed to be a closing question, a simple request for final thoughts on the role of government in personal freedoms. But by now, the conversation had left behind the realm of polite debate. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned into the microphone first, her voice calm but edged. "We talk about freedom, but we don't talk enough about whose freedom we're defending. Is it the billionaire who doesn't want to pay taxes, or the single mother struggling to find childcare? Because when someone says freedom, I ask, freedom for who?" There was applause, strong and confident from the left side of the room. AOC was back in her element, reclaiming ground. She glanced at Karoline, expecting her to fumble the nuance. Karoline didn't move right away. Then, in a tone quieter than before, she began. "You're right about one thing. Government does pick winners and losers. And the tragedy is, it often picks the loudest voices, not the most vulnerable." She paused, scanning the audience. "I've met families whose lives were torn apart by red tape and overreach. Small business owners fined out of existence. Parents labeled as extremists for asking questions at school board meetings. Their freedom matters too." Her voice rose, just slightly. "Government is not supposed to micromanage morality. It's supposed to protect liberty, not define it, not curate it, not license it." AOC leaned forward, visibly impatient. "So no safety nets? Just rugged individualism and bootstrap myths?" Karoline didn't blink. "A safety net is different from a straitjacket. I'm not against help. I'm against control disguised as help. When we centralize every decision in Washington, we don't empower people. We replace them." Now the room was shifting again. Not in a tidal wave, but in quiet realization. Karoline leaned in slightly. "Do you know what freedom really looks like? It's messy. It's people disagreeing, building, failing, trying again. It's not clean, but it's real. And if you try to sterilize it, you kill the very spirit that built this country." AOC tried to interject, but the moderator held up a hand, not out of bias, but because the crowd was visibly locked in. "And that," Karoline said finally, "is what I refuse to give up. Not for applause, not for polls, and certainly not for political convenience." The room didn't erupt. It stilled. That rare kind of silence that only follows something undeniably true. Even Alexandria, for a second, was quiet, not defeated, but disarmed. She turned to the moderator, signaling she was done speaking. But Karoline had already said enough. More than enough. The moderator cleared his throat, preparing to pivot the discussion. But the room had shifted. You could feel it in the posture of the crowd, less about spectacle now, more about gravity. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked down briefly at her notes, then up at the crowd. "We need bold vision," she said, "a new kind of country, and one where climate, health, education, and equity are universal rights, not partisan arguments. If that makes me radical, so be it." Applause rang out, loud, predictable, loyal. But Karoline didn't clap. She waited, then she stood. The moderator didn't call on her. She didn't need him to. The audience went still again. Karoline held the mic with both hands, her voice quieter than before. Not weakened, but sharpened like the calm in a storm's eye. "You want bold vision?" she said. "Here's mine." She glanced across the rows. "A government so small it can't crush your voice. A media so honest it doesn't have to be fact-checked in real time. A country where you can raise your kids without being told what they should believe by people who've never met them. A place where disagreement doesn't get you deplatformed and where truth doesn't change with the trending tab." Someone near the back murmured, "Wow." Karoline stepped forward. "I don't want a sanitized America. I want a strong one. One where your rights don't hinge on who's in power, what city you live in, or what hashtags you use. One where freedom means freedom, even for people you can't stand." That hit harder than anything she had said all night, not because it was flashy, because it was uncomfortably honest. AOC leaned back in her seat. For once, no comeback. Karoline raised a finger almost gently. We are dangerously close to becoming a country where politics replaces faith, where the party replaces the person, and where the government replaces the family. She looked toward the cameras. We can turn back, but we won't do it by shouting louder. We'll do it by remembering who we are and who we're not supposed to be. A long, drawn-out silence followed, and then a single clap, then another, and then the room stood, not for drama, but because something rare had just happened. Someone had said what most were afraid to think. Karoline sat back down, quietly, no grin, no triumph, just a fire lit and left burning. The auditorium was still buzzing long after Karoline sat back down, not from noise, but from the kind of electricity that lingers in a room after the air itself has changed. Some of the panelists whispered among themselves. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stared straight ahead, her hands folded tightly, her jaw slightly clenched. She hadn't been defeated, but she had been undeniably challenged. The moderator, clearly aware that the tone had shifted from debate to something deeper, gave no closing remarks. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "That concludes tonight's forum. Thank you all." But the story didn't end when the lights dimmed. Cameras had caught every second. Within an hour, clips of Karoline's final monologue exploded online. Some called her the voice of reason in an age of chaos. Others accused her of weaponized rhetoric. But the one thing no one could say was that she had gone unnoticed. On cable news, pundits scrambled to interpret her message. Conservative anchors hailed her as the heir to a new populist movement. Articulate, fearless, female. Liberal commentators dismissed her as a polished provocateur with dangerous ideas. But even they admitted she held her own. She didn't crack. She didn't dodge. In the following days, polls shifted slightly. Not massively, but noticeably. Younger viewers, especially independents, began to cite her performance as authentic, thought-provoking, and the only honest thing I've heard in months. In classrooms and coffee shops, her quotes echoed, "I don't want a sanitized America, I want a strong one." The power to silence is the most dangerous power a government can hold. It wasn't a policy paper. It wasn't a campaign ad. It was a cultural moment. And for Alexandria, it was a rare encounter with a challenger who didn't play to outrage, but to principle. Her team quietly admitted that the night hadn't gone as planned. But for Karoline, it wasn't about winning. It never had been. That night, alone in her hotel room, she rewatched the footage, not out of vanity, but to study her own face. She wanted to know if she had gone too far, if passion had overtaken discipline, if her voice had quivered at the wrong moment. But she saw something else. She saw resolve. In the reflection of the screen, her cross necklace glinted faintly under the room's dim lamp, a reminder of where her courage came from. Not from applause, not from attention, but from something older, something unshakable. A message from her father blinked onto her phone. "Proud of you. Keep your eyes forward. Don't let the noise become your compass." She smiled, just slightly. Karoline knew the fire she had walked into wasn't over. It would come again. Brighter, hotter, more ruthless. But so would she. Thank you for watching. What you just witnessed wasn't just a debate. It was a collision of values, convictions, and courage. In a room meant for talking points, one voice refused to be filtered, edited, or boxed in. Karoline Leavitt didn't just challenge the narrative, she rewrote the rules of the room. This moment reminds us that truth doesn't always come wrapped in applause. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, the kind that lingers long after the microphones are off. In an age of noise, clarity is rare. But when it comes, it cuts through everything. Tonight, Karoline didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She stood firm, not for attention, but for principle. Because in the end, it's not about winning the room, it's about changing the conversation. And tonight, she did exactly that. If this moved you, challenged you, or made you think twice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The next chapter is coming, and it's going to be louder.